All right, so are you ready to dive into some fascinating ideas about Taiwan's future?
Always.
We're exploring this book, Taiwan's Great Future, Today's Switzerland, Tomorrow's Taiwan. Have you had a chance to look at it?
I have, yeah. It's by Eugene Chang. And it's a really interesting take because it draws these parallels between Taiwan and, believe it or not, Switzerland. And it's not just about similarities on the surface level, like their mountains and limited natural resources. What's really intriguing is how the book dives into the economic and social structures of both nations to see if Switzerland's model could actually work for Taiwan.
Right, and we're talking big differences in GDP per capita, so there's definitely something to unpack there. But this whole Switzerland comparison reminded me of this time I was working on the Taiwan high-speed rail project.
Oh, yeah.
We had this Swiss engineer on the team, a total stickler for details. He was overseeing the construction of this temporary warehouse. And I remember thinking, it's temporary, how much detail can there be?
I can only imagine what happened.
Well, let's just say this guy insisted on perfectly designed structural joints to eliminate any bending stress. Like, every single detail had to be perfect, even for a building that was meant to be torn down.
Ah, the classic devil is in the details approach. You can't argue with Switzerland's reputation for quality, right?
Yeah. And get this, that temporary warehouse ended up being the toughest building on the entire site. It went through typhoons, even a few earthquakes, and barely had a scratch on it. Meanwhile, some of the permanent structures had issues.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Wow. That's a perfect example of what the author seems to be getting at. Switzerland's success, their economic power, might be linked to this meticulous approach, this focus on quality in everything they do.
It makes you wonder if that kind of thinking is what Taiwan needs to reach that next level, right? Yeah. But here's where the book takes a turn. It throws in these examples that might seem totally unrelated at first. It's like there's a whole section about the lawsuit against Swiss banks for those Holocaust victims' assets. And then there's the story of that Taiwanese sports anchor, Fu Deren, who chose assisted suicide in Switzerland.
And at first glance, you wouldn't think those stories have anything to do with economic success. But the author uses them to illustrate some of the less obvious aspects of the Swiss model. They've built this reputation for neutrality and financial discretion, which has attracted a lot of wealth, even if the source of that wealth is ethically questionable at times.
And when it comes to assisted suicide, they've turned it into a very efficient and some might say profitable system, which is a stark contrast to how we handle healthcare in Taiwan, with our focus on providing affordable and comprehensive care.
Exactly. It really makes you think about the trade-offs, the potential ethical dilemmas that can come with different paths to economic prosperity. What the author seems to be advocating is for Taiwan to focus on high-value industries like finance, luxury goods, tourism, similar to what Switzerland has done.
It's making me see Switzerland in a whole new light.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of different perspectives, I was pretty surprised to learn about their energy mix, hydropower and nuclear energy. Not exactly the picture postcard image you usually associate with the Swiss Alps, especially compared to Taiwan, where we're still pretty reliant on fossil fuels.
It is unexpected. But when you think about it, they've skillfully used their mountainous terrain to their advantage with hydropower. And their commitment to nuclear energy, even with all the public anxieties surrounding it, shows a different approach to energy independence.
So then the question is, could we do something similar here in Taiwan? Mountains, right? Can we ramp up our hydropower capabilities?
It's definitely something to consider. Although the book actually argues for a more aggressive push towards solar energy. Imagine government buildings, public land, all covered with solar panels. Not only would it generate a significant amount of energy, but it'd be a powerful visual statement.
And it's not just about putting up panels, right? The book talks about streamlining the whole process, making it easier for people to adopt solar, like less red tape, faster approvals. We've also got offshore wind power going for us, which seems like a no-brainer.
Absolutely. No land acquisition issues, fewer environmental concerns. It's a huge opportunity for Taiwan. The book even suggests this thing called energy liberalization, basically allowing consumers to choose their electricity provider.
Instead of everyone being stuck with Taipower.
Exactly. It could create some healthy competition, boost innovation in renewables.
I like where this is going. Speaking of innovation, there's this wild idea in the book about a vehicle-to-grid system. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept, the idea of using electric vehicles as, mobile energy storage units.
So how would that work?
So imagine you charge your car at night when electricity demand is low, and then during the day, you can actually send some of that power back to the grid when demand is high.
Interesting.
It could help stabilize renewable energy sources and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels.
That's some next level thinking right there.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about housing. This one really surprised me. Did you know that only 40% of Swiss residents actually own their homes?
Yeah, it is kind of surprising considering their reputation for, economic stability. But it challenges our assumptions about homeownership, doesn't it? In Switzerland, renting is very common, and more importantly, it's affordable.
It makes you wonder if our obsession with homeownership here in Taiwan is really serving us, especially with rising housing costs, the challenges young people face trying to buy a place.
Yeah, no, it's a complex issue. The book actually cautions against excessive government intervention in the housing market because it can sometimes do more harm than good.
Oh, how so?
Well, for example, flooding the market with cheap housing might seem like a solution, but it can lead to a market collapse in the long run.
So what's the alternative? How does Switzerland manage to keep its rental market so affordable and stable?
Well, the author proposes a more balanced approach for Taiwan. He suggests encouraging the development of new housing units that are specifically designed for rent rather than for sale. And he also talks about something called real estate securitization.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm not quite sure I follow that one.
Sure. Basically, it's a way to attract more investment into the rental market. Think of it like bundling a bunch of rental properties together and selling shares of that bundle to investors. It can boost liquidity, allow more people to participate in the rental market, and ideally, that makes it more stable and affordable for everyone.
It sounds complicated, but I get the general idea. More options for renters, more stability in the market. That's something we can all get behind. But let's talk about Taiwan's financial sector for a second. We both know we've got some catching up to do if we're aiming to compete with a financial giant like Switzerland, right?
Right.
So what does this book say?
Well, the author has this bold vision for Taiwan's financial future, one that leans heavily into innovation and capitalizes on emerging trends.
Like what? Give us the inside scoop.
Okay, get this. The book suggests positioning Taiwan as a global hub for virtual currency asset management, essentially becoming a haven for all things cryptocurrency.
Wow, that's a bold move. But how would that even work?
He talks about establishing clear regulatory frameworks, specifically things like financial sandboxes. These are like controlled environments where companies can test out new financial technologies without being bogged down by traditional regulations.
So kind of like a safe space for crypto experimentation, attracting investment and talent.
Exactly, and it doesn't stop there. The book also explores the idea of a remote gambling management center, essentially leveraging Taiwan's existing expertise in, online gambling customer service to create a more ethical and regulated industry on a global scale.
A remote gambling management center. Now, that's an interesting thought. Imagine Taiwan becoming the watchdog of the global gambling industry. It's definitely something to ponder.
And there's more. He also proposes a remote asset management center, capitalizing on Taiwan's geopolitical advantages to attract international investors looking for a safe and stable place to park their assets. It's like he's looked at all of Taiwan's strengths, right, and found ways to, amplify them on a global stage.
It's definitely ambitious. But let's talk about something a little closer to home. Healthcare. Taiwan's healthcare system is often praised for its affordability and accessibility. Could we actually become a global leader in this area?
The book seems to think so. It proposes creating a global remote healthcare center, allowing people worldwide to access Taiwanese healthcare services remotely.
What do you mean?
Imagine, telemedicine consultations with Taiwanese doctors, even medication deliveries to remote areas.
That's a really intriguing idea. Think about the impact we could have, using technology to provide quality healthcare to people who might not have access otherwise. But let's talk about education for a second. One thing that's always bothered me is how heavy those textbooks are that kids have to lug around. It's like they're training for a weightlifting competition.
I know, right? It's crazy. And we live in a digital age. The book argues for a transition to digital textbooks, just like we've done with music and movies and books, right?
It makes perfect sense. Not only would it lighten the load for our kids, but it could potentially save money, reduce waste. And while we're talking about education, the book also dives into the idea of remote learning.
Yeah, there's huge potential there. Imagine students from all over the world learning from Taiwanese teachers, interacting with each other in virtual classrooms. It could revolutionize our education system, attract international students.
It's exciting to think about.
Yeah.
But with all the benefits, there must be challenges too, right?
Of course, yeah. There will be resistance from traditional institutions, concerns about technology access, ensuring effective online teaching methods. But the book argues that the potential benefits, especially increased transparency and accountability in education, are worth exploring.
I have to agree with that. Transparency and accountability are never bad things. But the author doesn't stop there. He proposes this radical idea called 0 to 12 years old, raised by the nation.
It sounds more dramatic than it is, right? Essentially, he envisions a system where education for all children up to 12 years old is completely free.
Free? How would that even be possible?
Well, he suggests it would be funded by revenue generated from real estate transactions, specifically those involving historic buildings and public landmarks. And to ensure long-term sustainability, he suggests a potential wealth tax later in life for those who benefited from this free education. It's a real conversation starter, isn't it? And it got me thinking about how we often compare Taiwan to Singapore, but focusing on Switzerland instead, like the author does, really shifts your perspective.
It's a really interesting comparison, especially when you think about how both Taiwan and Switzerland have had to navigate, those tricky geopolitical waters,
Right.
existing as independent entities right next to larger, more powerful neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
They've both had to get really good at adapting, relying on their own ingenuity.
And we can't forget about, the whole issue of national identity. That's something close to home for Taiwan. With our, complex history with mainland China, the ongoing discussions about our place in the world, this book dives into those similarities, those differences, head on.
So how does Switzerland factor into all of this? They seem to have a pretty strong sense of national identity.
Well, it's interesting because Switzerland has its own internal diversity to deal with. Multiple languages, cultural influences, kind of like a mini Europe.
Right.
The book explores how they've managed to create this sense of unity within that diversity, which is something Taiwan can definitely learn from.
It makes you wonder, how do they do it? What's their secret sauce? How do they
Yeah.
maintain harmony with all those different influences?
It's a fascinating question, and the author really gets into the nitty-gritty of it, especially regarding language, cultural preservation, even that whole debate they had about Heidi.
Heidi, the children's book character.
Yeah. So there was this whole thing in Switzerland a while back where some evidence emerged suggesting Heidi might actually be German, not Swiss.
Oh, wait.
Oh, yeah. It caused a bit of an identity crisis.
You're kidding? I remember reading Heidi as a kid. I had no idea it was such a big deal.
It just goes to show how deeply these cultural symbols, these stories, become intertwined with a nation's identity. And the book encourages us to take a step back, critically examine our own narratives here in Taiwan, the past, the present, how we even envision the future.
It's like holding up a mirror to ourselves and deciding what we want to see reflected back.
Exactly. And this deep dive has been quite the journey, hasn't it? We've gone from energy and housing to finance, healthcare, even the future of our education system.
It's amazing to think that all of this came from a book comparing Taiwan to Switzerland. And what I find so refreshing is that the author doesn't shy away from the tough questions.
Not at all. He's clearly passionate about Taiwan's future, and it shows in his willingness to explore, those unconventional solutions, challenge our assumptions.
Right.
It's a call to action, encouraging all of us to think critically about the kind of future we want to create.
And to remember that we all have a role to play in shaping that future. So